A rags-to-riches comedic star who helped make the emergent U.S. film industry wildly popular, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle fell afoul of the first big Hollywood scandal. It pretty much ruined his career, but he's considered one of the real pioneers in the movie business. Here's the true story of Fatty Arbuckle. Roscoe Arbuckle was born in 1887 in Smith Center, Kansas. He was a big baby, weighing in at about 13 pounds, but his father William doubted his own paternity, since he and Arbuckle's mother were quite slender. That flimsy assumption turned into disdain, with William naming his son after Senator Roscoe Conkling, a notorious womanizer William despised. The family moved to California when Arbuckle was a year old. He had a rough upbringing. Biographer Stuart Oderman notes that William, who was probably a high-functioning alcoholic, was frequently absent, regularly beat Roscoe, and eventually left his family to fend for themselves. When Arbuckle's mother passed away when he was 10, Roscoe traveled to the hotel where his father and older brother worked, only to find them gone. The hotel staff took pity on Roscoe, feeding him and letting him stay in a tiny closet that had been converted into a bedroom. The young boy began doing odd jobs around the hotel in exchange for his room and board, but he never forgave his father for what he saw as nothing less than a betrayal. That hotel gave him his first big break. The hotel's resident musician, Pansy Jones, noticed he liked to sing. Soon, Arbuckle was singing for tips on quiet nights. The Vintage News reports that he eventually found himself in a local talent show for amateurs with a notoriously tough crowd. If a performer didn't meet the crowd's approval, the classic shepherd's crook emerged from the side of the stage and pulled him or her off, much to the delight of the audience. Arbuckle apparently performed a loosely organized bit where he clowned about and sang, but the audience was unimpressed and began to boo and heckle him. Arbuckle was a surprisingly athletic and graceful man considering his size, and when he saw the hook coming, he raced away and did a perfect somersault directly into the orchestra pit. The mood of the audience shifted instantly, and Arbuckle won their approval. When he later lost his job at the hotel, he returned to the theater and lucked into an opening slot at that night's performance. He was on the fast track to movie industry stardom. Back in the early 20th century, people were pretty direct, sometimes cruel with nicknames. PBS reports that Arbuckle got his name Fatty when he was just 8 years old. Author Stuart Oderman noted that by the age of 12, Arbuckle was almost 200 pounds and more than 5 feet tall. At the height of his fame, the actor weighed close to 300 pounds. Even though his size was part of his on-screen persona, Arbuckle was self-conscious about his weight. This was partially because of his father being generally an awful person and taunting him for his size. Arbuckle complained that Fatty was a childish nickname unsuitable for an adult man. As movie studios listed him as Fatty, it got to the point where, as Vintage News recounts, even his fans were calling him, quote, the Prince of Wales and, quote, the Balloonatic. And apparently all he replied was, I've got a name, you know. Seriously, this guy had thicker skin than his contemporary Al Capone did.
I want him dead. I want him dead. I'm dead. What, am I alone in this world? Did I ask you what you're trying to do?
He had other ways of deflecting attention, like buying everyone drinks as cover for his increasing discomfort around his appearance. Beneath the humorous exterior he put on screen, his weight was causing health problems. Vintage News reported that heavy drinking combined with his weight led to a serious infection in his leg in 1916 when he was just 29 years old. Arbuckle initially attempted to handle the painful, debilitating infection by having incisions made to drain the pus, and by taking heroin for the pain. This course of treatment left him delirious and did little to heal his leg. In fact, after a week, his doctor informed him they would have to amputate the leg below the knee to stop the infection from spreading and possibly killing him. Luckily, a second opinion indicated his leg could be saved, but Arbuckle was sent to a hospital to do a stint for what we would call rehab today. When he emerged some weeks later, he was free of his addiction and he had lost nearly 100 pounds, but had to walk with the help of 2 canes. Unfortunately, returning to work meant Arbuckle had to regain the weight he'd lost. The show had to go on with the Arbuckle the audience knew and loved. By 1921, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle had taken the newly formed movie industry by storm, raking in cash and fame. Smithsonian Magazine reports that he had sealed a deal with Paramount Pictures for $3 million, about $45 million in today's money, with a fresh contract for more films. But the man was also tired. As Britannica recounts, he had just completed 3 films back-to-back. He'd also just suffered burns on his rear end from mistakenly sitting in acid. His friend Fred Fishback suggested it was time to get away from work and enjoy the roaring 20s. So fancy hotel suites in San Francisco were duly booked and bootlegged booze procured for an epic 3-day party over Labor Day weekend. As reported by BBC News, Virginia Rapay, an actress who attended that party, fell ill and had to be taken to the hospital. She died a few days later, and her friend, who had also attended the party, Maud Delmont, accused Arbuckle of raping Rapay, leading to her death. Details of the party are jumbled, and some claim Delmont was a fraudster. In fact, all that's interesting reports Delmont sent telegrams bragging about fleecing Arbuckle.
I think the only crime I've found that she hadn't committed was probably murder. I think everything else she was up for.
She wasn't even called to testify in court against Arbuckle. The prosecution knew her reputation and habit of changing her story wouldn't serve their case, despite the fact that she was the accuser. The charges against Arbuckle were big news. The San Francisco Examiner reported that William Randolph Hearst's newspaper went after Arbuckle with a vengeance and a near-total lack of concern about facts. The stories focused on the wild nature of the party, painting Hollywood as an immoral cesspool of hedonism. Arbuckle was depicted as a drug addict, a drunk, and a philanderer, and headlines such as, quote, Fatty arraigned as slayer and, quote, Fatty gross sensualist hit the newsstands. Hollywood didn't really back him up. The Independent reported that Arbuckle's films were banned from movie theaters in the wake of the accusations, and Will Hayes, who had recently been hired by the studios to help protect the industry's image, banned Arbuckle from working in the movies. Within a few days, Arbuckle went from being one of the best paid and most loved actors of the time to being completely ruined, all before a single piece of evidence had been brought against him. As detailed by the Bar Association of San Francisco, Fatty Arbuckle was indicted for manslaughter by a grand jury impaneled by the district attorney shortly after Virginia Rapay's death. But then the DA ignored the indictment and charged Arbuckle with felony murder. The actor was taken into police custody. This happened despite most of the evidence, including the autopsy, having yet to arrive. The trial went poorly for the prosecution. Smithsonian Magazine explained that Arbuckle's lawyers presented evidence that Rapay had died of pre-existing medical conditions. The state thought better of putting Delmont on the stand for reasons already mentioned. The jury couldn't agree on a verdict, voting 10-2 for acquittal. But the prosecution refused to give up and forced a second trial. Again, the jury couldn't come to a unanimous decision, voting 9-3 to convict. So a third trial was necessary. This time, Arbuckle and his defense team attacked Rapay's character, got several witnesses to admit they'd been threatened by the prosecution, and Arbuckle once again took the stand to argue his case. As reported by BBC News, Arbuckle was acquitted. Not only was he found not guilty, but the jury took just 5 minutes to reach that verdict, much of which was spent writing an unprecedented apology note to Arbuckle. Roscoe Arbuckle married actress Minta Durfee in 1908. As described in the biography by Stuart Oderman, Durfee initially regarded her affair with Arbuckle as a summer fling, but when she told Arbuckle she planned to return to her family, he reportedly dangled her over the ocean and demanded that she marry him. Pretty dramatic, even for an actor. According to the New York Times, Durfee and Arbuckle had separated just before he was charged with rape and manslaughter and were living on separate coasts. But as reported by Feminism 3.0, Durfee traveled back to California with her mother to appear at her husband's side and pose for photos. She sat in court in obvious support of Roscoe, which certainly helped his cause. Durfee's support was a bit of an acting job, however. As reported by Time in 1924, she officially sued Arbuckle for divorce, alleging desertion. Authors Stephen Shermack and Frankie Y. Bailey explained that the couple attempted a reconciliation, but it didn't succeed. Arbuckle didn't contest the divorce, and it was eventually granted. After being charged with rape and manslaughter and watching his career and significant fortune disappear over the course of 3 expensive trials, Arbuckle understandably struggled. Although he worked towards a comeback for the rest of his life, he also fell into heavy drinking, and the booze affected his work. He began working as a director under the pseudonym William Goodrich, but didn't exactly bring a lot of energy to the work. According to actress Louise Brooks, who worked with him on one film, Arbuckle made no attempt to direct this picture. He sat in his chair like a man dead. He had been very nice and sweetly dead ever since a scandal that ruined his career. The alcoholism and depression didn't stop Arbuckle from working, and work he did. The Washington Post reports that he married his third wife, Addie MacPhail, in 1932 after he directed her in a film as William Goodrich. The two then began planning a vaudeville tour that Arbuckle hoped would re-establish him as a popular performer, and the plan worked. After one performance in 1932, Arbuckle was contacted by Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers. Warner offered Arbuckle an acting job in a short film under his own name. Arbuckle went on to make a series of comedy shorts for Warner, and BBC News reports that in 1933, the studio offered Arbuckle a contract to appear in new feature films. Arbuckle, obviously thrilled, signed it.
This job's still open.
Oh, you are a baker.
Yes, sir, and I sure need dough.
Sadly, as related by author Greg Merritt, Arbuckle then went home with MacPhail, went to bed, and died of a heart attack in his sleep. His comeback was in full swing, and the world was left wondering what his career with Warner Brothers would have been like. Even with the accusations against him, the fact that someone as famous as Fatty Arbuckle is so obscure and largely forgotten today might seem strange. After all, other stars of his caliber from the time, like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, are still well known today. Arbuckle's plummet from fame, of course, was a result of his being charged with some serious crimes. Movie theaters boycotted his films, the studios banned him, and some of his films' negatives were burned entirely, as reported by Hennis Communications. DVD Talk explains the reaction made Arbuckle's existing films basically worthless. If you couldn't show them anywhere, why bother preserving them? Since Arbuckle was broke after his 3 trials, he couldn't pay to preserve his films himself. As author Richard Ward has noted, only a small number of Arbuckle's films survive today. In the earliest days of Hollywood, there was no organized method for rating films or controlling their content. Studio Binder explains that this period is usually referred to as pre-code Hollywood. It's the period before the Motion Picture Production Code, sometimes referred to as the Hays Code after Will Hays, the man who implemented it. Pre-code movies often depicted brutal violence and some sexual content and tackled subjects that were taboo at the time, like divorce. As NPR points out, Arbuckle's arrest and trial supported the idea that Hollywood and the people who worked there were morally corrupt, and the films they made were therefore corrupting. Films were decried as smut, and pressure mounted for the government to censor movies for the public good. The Hays Code was a voluntary code of conduct and content that the studios implemented in order to avoid that kind of interference from the government. That adoption has its roots in the sensational trial of Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration's 24/7 national helpline at 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357.